here in a series of messages called Does God Still Speak? And John Chappell spoke last week, and he answered that question immediately, and the answer is yes. And I would also say the answer is absolutely yes. God does still speak. Pastor Greg asked me to speak on the topic of the still small voice. And that's how God speaks majority of the time, at least it's been my experience. John talked about the fact that God speaks through his word. And the word of God is inspired, written through men by the Holy Spirit. And over the years, I got to the point where I started learning how to hear God speak. Sometimes you talk to people and they'll say, God never speaks to me. And I used to be that person. And the answer to that is, no, you're incorrect. He does speak. Apostle Paul says there are many voices in the world. That the problem is we sometimes haven't learned to discern which voice is his, which is not. God does speak. And over the years, I have heard God speak a bunch of times, and some of them have been profoundly life-changing. And so as I was studying and praying about this message, asking God, what is it you want me to talk about? He pointed out an occasion when he spoke into my life. 11 words that changed my life forever. We see the first instance of talking about the still small voice in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. It's Elijah, the prophet, who is running from Jezebel after the confrontation with the 500 prophets of Baal. And they're all killed, and Jezebel threatens his life and said, by tomorrow at this time, you're going to be dead. And Elijah runs and runs and runs. He's discouraged. And he has this conversation with God like, there's nobody left. I'm the only one serving you. And God asks him, where are you? What are you doing here? And we have the account of him hiding in a cave, and then there's a great storm, and he's listening for God, and God's voice is not in the storm. And then there was like a fire that raged through the mountain he was in, and God's voice was not in the fire. And finally he heard God in, King James calls it the still small voice. The other translations call it a gentle whisper. Interestingly enough, when he hears God speak, he says the very same thing he said before. Why are you here? What are you doing here? So that's the first occurrence of that expression. I wanted to look at another section which speaks to me, and it's in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 through 8. You might want to turn there. We're going to read this whole thing, the first 8 verses. This is the account of David. Now, the backstory here is that David is now fled from Saul, who's trying to kill him. And he's decided the only way to be safe from Saul is to go and live in the land of the Philistines. And he's actually there for a number of years. And he's made friends with the Philistines, which just seems odd since he killed Goliath and his brothers. But now he's in the land of the Philistines, and he's living there, and with him are his mighty men. I think it's like 400 men who traveled with David, who went with David, who fought with David in different places. In this account, David has come back from all these adventures with the men back to a town called Ziklag. And whenever I think of Ziklag, this account comes to mind, and you'll see it. So I'm going to read the first 8 verses. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag, and this is the town where all their wives, their children, their possessions were, and they came back to Ziklag on the 3rd day. The Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both great and small and great. They killed no one, but they carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. When I see that verse, it reminds me of a verse in Psalms where David says, "Why so downcast, O my soul? Put your hope in God." No matter what's happening, put your future in the hands of God. Know that he is there. That's what comes to mind. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Verse 7, and David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech. So apparently one of the men that was traveling with David was a priest. David said, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. Now the ephod was the garment of a priest that David sometimes wore when he was worshiping God. We see that all through the Old Testament story of David. He would put on that ephod, which technically was something he wasn't supposed to do. But because he had that kind of relationship with God, he would put on this ephod, this garment. And David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?" He answered him, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue." So after all this, after all the agony, the pain, the hurt, the devastation of seeing everything that he knew and loved and all their stuff gone, and crying until he had no strength left to cry, David cries out to God and asks him, "Should I pursue?" And God answered David, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake and you shall surely rescue." So a couple of points that I see in this story that's going to relate to the small voice, and I'm going to talk about when God spoke to me in that one instance, 11 words that changed my life. In this section, we see that David loses his family, his 2 wives, all the wives and daughters, sons and daughters of his men, gone, captive, none of them killed. They were destroyed, but their families being gone. They all, it says, wept until they had no more strength. David strengthened himself. He inquired of the Lord. God spoke. Interesting, I was looking at this. In the Old Testament, we're wondering, how did God speak? Well, we know in different circumstances, God would speak through prophets, definitely. There are times when God would speak in an audible voice. And there were times when you heard from God through a priest. In this particular case, there's a priest there. But it doesn't say that God spoke through the priest. It doesn't say the priest said anything. It also doesn't say that they heard a voice from heaven. There's no indication it was an audible voice, but David heard God answer. So my question to you is, how important was it for David to hear God's voice? Consider what would have happened if he hadn't. This was early on in David's life. He hadn't been made king, even though he'd been anointed by Samuel when he was little. He wasn't yet king over the Judah and Israel. He's totally devastated. This is before he wrote 2/3 of the book of Psalms. It's before many of the things that happened. We see the exploits of David before Solomon was born. What would have happened if he hadn't heard from God? That might have been the end of it for him. His men may have killed him. They were in the land of the Philistines. The Philistines. He might not have survived very long if he hadn't heard from God. How important is it for you to hear from God? As I was studying this, I recalled the fact that the Israelites, as they went through the wilderness, God, the word says, fed them manna from heaven for 40 years. And in Matthew chapter, it was actually in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus was talking to people, and the Pharisees asked him, or some of the doubters, are you going to show us a sign and do a miracle? Will you call manna from heaven? And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. The word tells us that the Old Testament was written as types and shadows of things pointing to the New Testament. So what God is saying is that the manna from heaven in the Old Testament pointing to Jesus being the bread of life coming from God. Life. And Jesus had his own wilderness experience. We see that in the beginning after he was baptized. He goes into the wilderness. He doesn't eat for 40 days, apparently. I think that's what it said. And he was hungry, and the devil, who was speaking to him, trying to tempt him, says, you can turn these stones into bread. And Jesus answers, and most of us are probably familiar with the verse. I learned it when I was little. Matthew 4:4, Jesus says to the devil, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Again, Jesus is equating bread with the word. Now, growing up, I translated in my head, man shall not live by every word, but by the Bible. That's the way I thought of it. But it doesn't say that. Jesus didn't say man shall live by the Torah or by the law and the prophets or by the scripture. He didn't say that. He said the words that proceed from the mouth of God. Now, when I was studying this, I was thinking of a title for this message because it helps me keep track of them better. And the title that came to me was, I live because he speaks. I live because he speaks. And Jesus is saying that I was sent. John says that Jesus was the Word of God made flesh. So Jesus was the Word. He speaks the Word. He is the manna from heaven. He is the thing that gives us life. So how important is it that we hear from him? That we hear God speak? God told David, pursue, and you shall surely overtake and shall rescue. I looked at that and I saw the three verbs. God told him, pursue, overtake, and rescue. And the account of the story, if we go back to it, they went after this army of Amalekites who had taken all their family, their wives, their children, their servants, and their possessions. David and his 400 men, actually 200 stayed behind. It was 600 men. 200 stayed behind because they were exhausted. And with the rest of his men, he went after the Amalekites. He caught up with them, and he defeated all of them, except, the word says, for 400 who escaped on camels. A small part of them got away on camels, but David and his crew overcame them all. It says he got all their wives and children back, all their possessions back, and the rest of the spoils from this army. They brought back a lot extra. How important was it that David heard from God? So how important is it for you to hear from God? How important is it for me to hear from God? So the illustration, the example of God speaking in my life that he pointed out to me and wanted me to share, it's 11 words. And if I had told you those 11 words in the beginning, it might not have meant much to you. So I'll tell you what was going on in my life at the time. It was a very painful time in my life, probably the most painful time of my life, where everything seemed to be coming to an end. It was the time when my marriage had ended. Back in the early days of our marriage, we got together. She was my best friend. She was all I could think about. She was my life, everything that I had to look forward to involved being with her. But after we were married, things began to happen, as they often do in marriages. You go through disappointments. You get hurts. You get calluses. You put up walls to protect yourself. And you become insensitive. And those are mostly what happened to me. Most of what happened was my fault. And so I was thinking about this. This is the illustration that sometimes people use about putting a frog in boiling water. If you try to put a frog into boiling water, he jumps out. But if you put him in a pot of water, room temperature, and you turn the heat on low, it gradually gets hotter and hotter, and he'll die in that water because it's so gradual. And what happened in our marriage was much like that. It gradually got worse, and our relationship became difficult. We had a lot of problem years, and it was painful. But we went through the motions. We were believers. We were in church. We went to church. We never missed church. We were elders. We were in leadership. But yet our relationship was suffering and getting worse and worse. And while it's so gradual, sometimes the last people to see they have a problem are the people themselves. People on the outside often see it. I remember how many times that God would speak to me and show me something I had a problem with. I'm thinking, oh, thank you for showing me before anybody else found out. And God says, everybody else knows. You're the last one to figure it out. Some of you may have experienced that. You see people, and you know they got a problem. They don't think anybody else knows they have a problem, but it's pretty clear to anybody outside. So we had this thing, and I'm thinking, yeah, we're working through it. We're just surviving. We're going through the motions. We're raising our kids. We're going to church. We're involved in ministry, but our relationship was hurting, and we went through some very bad years. And during that time, of course, she's praying for me that I'll change. I'm praying for her that she'll change. You know how it is. It's really them. We don't see our own problems near as clearly. But gradually, I'm starting to realize things aren't as good as they used to be. So I was praying about it. One day, I remember this particular day, I was praying at home. I was by myself, and I was standing in the kitchen looking into the living room. I can see the exact spot. And something very unusual happened. And that was I got a revelation from God. I don't know the real biblical terminology for it, but it's like 1 minute you're in the dark, and next minute he turns on the light, and how did I not see this before? And what he showed me on the left side was the relationship we used to have. And first year of our marriage and the year before we got married. And on the right hand, I could see the marriage we had now. And I was filled with remorse and sorry. And how could I have let it come to this? How could I get to this point that it's so this bad? And a lot of times revelation will change you. Revelation, it's when we hear from God that changes us. And most times when God works on us, it's gradual, it's a process. A lot of things are a process, but occasionally he'll do something where it's a revelation and you see it and it immediately changes you. A good example of that is Paul on the road to Damascus or Tarsus. He thinks he's serving God by persecuting the church, arresting and killing Christians. And then Jesus appears to him. And that conversation, if you look at it, might have been less than 5 minutes. And yet, when that was done, he was a totally different person. Totally different view of God, totally different view of his mission in life. He was changed dramatically by the revelation of who Jesus is. And that God will do sometimes. He's done that probably 3 times in my life. And so at that moment, I saw what we had before, and I was overcome by remorse by the relationship that I had let happen. And I immediately wanted to have my best friend back. I wanted her back. But I knew she wouldn't. She'd given up. I knew she wouldn't receive. If I told her what just happened, I knew she wouldn't receive it. So I thought, okay, I have now got to live my life the way I should have been living it, treat her the way I should, and instead of just telling her I'm changed, let her see that. So she was on my mind all the time. I was always looking for things to do for her. I became the guy who did the laundry, did the dishes, and everything I could see around the house that will make her happy if I do that. And I'd go shopping and I'd be praying, God, show me what I can buy her to show her that I love her. And after about a month, I think it was a month, not really sure, I came up to her and I said, so how are we doing? How am I doing? And she said, oh, we're fine. Everything's wonderful. Everything's fine. And that told me two things. One is she didn't have anything to yell at me about, which is good, because if there had been something, I'd have heard about it. But the other was I hadn't reached her heart. She hadn't really noticed the change. Sometimes when you've been away for a certain way for a long time, and you change, people don't notice it right away until you bring it to their attention or enough time goes by. So I thought, okay. So I waited another month and did the same thing, got pretty much the same answer. Okay. And another month. And finally, I thought, now would be a good time at 3 or 4 months to tell her what God showed me. I'm thinking I'm going to explain the revelation I got. So I asked how I was doing, and everything's fine, you're good, everything's good, you know. And I said, I want us to be best friends again. And she looked up into my eyes. This was a tough one. Okay, this message was not easy to prepare for. So just putting that out there. She looked up in my eyes, and with a sincerity I hadn't seen in years, and I didn't even realize I hadn't seen it. She looked up into my eyes and she said, it's too late. Which was like being kicked in the stomach. And I felt panic rise up in me. A physical thing. I don't know if you've ever had panic where it's actually a physical feeling. And it began to rise up in me. And then I heard God speak to me. And he said, it's not too late. And the panic went away. And a peace came over me. And that was the end of the conversation. And I did the same thing another month. And it was the same answer. I really desperately wanted God to show her what he showed me, to change her like he'd changed me. But he didn't. Where's my coffee? Thank you. So one day, it was a Saturday, it was in March, I can tell you the date. One day I went up to her and asked her again, how am I doing? Same answer. And this time I couldn't settle for that. So I just kept asking her, what is in your heart? What do you feel to me, about me? And she went from being calm and neutral to being extremely angry. Angrier than I can remember seeing her. And she just went off on me. And she told me that living with me had been nothing but pain. And it was horrible. And she didn't want to live like that anymore. She was leaving and she wanted a divorce. Not exactly the reaction I was hoping for. And for the next hours, she recounted all the things I had done, the mistakes I had made, the way I treated her, the things I'd said. And it was a lot of them. After 25 years of marriage, there's a fair number there. And she, angry the whole time, just recounting all these things. And I'm feeling worse and worse and worse. And it got really bad, and she was saying some pretty horrible things about me, and she tore my heart out and shredded it, basically. And this conversation went on for at least 3 hours. And I'm trying to apologize, and I'm trying to remind her of some of the good times we had, and nothing changed that. Because at first I'm thinking she's just venting, and that was a good thing, but after a while I realized it was a lot more than that. And so all night until it was late, and I remember sobbing and crying, and nothing I could do could change what was happening. That was a Saturday. I asked her if she would go to church with me the next day. We'd always gone to church. She never refused to go to church, but she would not go with me. And I desperately needed to go to church the next day. And I was on the praise and worship team, and I was one of the keyboard players. I was scheduled to be on the next day. But we woke up early, we were doing more talking, and while rested and things were more calm, nothing had changed. Her determination to end our marriage. So I knew I needed to go, had to go, be on the team and then not show up. And I needed to be there. But I was terrified that if I went, she would be gone when I got back. I don't remember talking to anybody. And maybe I didn't. Maybe I just showed up and avoided everybody. If you'd asked me what songs we were doing that morning, I didn't remember any of them. I didn't know. But I just got up there and we did, the songs you usually do, whatever they were. I think it was the third song in the set was I Will Follow You by Chris Tomlin. Where you go, I will go. And I'm singing from my heart, because I was praying furiously on the way to church, and I'm praying the whole time. And I'm singing this from my heart, I will go. And I get to the second part of the song. It says, if this life I lose, I will follow you. And I sang that, if this life I lose, and then I totally lost it. I don't know if you've ever cried in church before. It can be a uncomfortable experience. I don't know if you've ever cried uncontrollably on the stage with a microphone in your hand. That's on a different level altogether. But I couldn't stop. So I'm up there. I had enough presence of mind to lower the microphone, which is good. But I couldn't stop crying, couldn't sing. And I don't remember what happened after that. Somehow the praise and worship ended. We ended up off the stage. I sat in the back because I needed to get home as quick as possible. As soon as the service ended, I was out the door. I didn't want anybody to talk to me. I didn't need to be distracted. I wouldn't have been able to hold it together. I had to get back. I had to go home. I need to get home. I need to get home. I got home, her car was gone. She was gone. And my kids are all adults, and they were all off at church. 2 of them were married. So I was home alone in the house, and I didn't know where she was. I finally got up the courage to call her phone. It went directly to voicemail, and that never happened before. And I tried several times in the next bunch of hours, and finally she answered the phone, and she says, I will come home, but you need to call the kids, and I'll have them all come over because I need to talk to them. And that was not a good sign for me. And that's what happened. So eventually she comes home, the kids are there. Well, they came in little by little. And she tells them, I'm condensing this all a lot, but she basically tells them that we're getting a divorce. And my kids are in shock and they're crying, and that was a incredibly painful experience to see your kids, your daughter sobbing. And that's the context of what happened. It looked like it was over. And when she was out, she had found a place to live. She had talked to a friend of hers who agreed that she could live there, so she was going to pack up and leave that night. And so I didn't get a whole lot of sleep that night. I spent much of the night crying, binding and loosing, and yelling at the devil. That was what I did. Then I called into work and said I had a family crisis. I worked in Buffalo at the time. Had a family crisis and not coming in. Stayed home. Kids had all decided they decided amongst themselves that they were going to stay with me. Somebody was going to always be with me all day long. That was kind of an amazing thing. And so I was never alone except at night. So that night, Monday night, I couldn't sleep, so I spent most time crying and then binding and loosing and yelling at the devil. And the next day I called in again, not coming in. And that night I couldn't sleep, and I spent most of the night crying and binding and loosing and yelling at the devil. And it went on like that for, I don't know, a couple weeks. I don't know. Then the night happened. The day I'm talking about, the 11 words. I went to bed. I went upstairs in my room again and couldn't sleep. I cried until I couldn't cry anymore. And then I remember I cried out to God, literally, out loud, God, what do you want me to do? And then he spoke to me. Didn't expect it. I did not expect it. I was surprised. And he said the 11 words. They changed my life. That changed our circumstances, that resurrected our marriage, and turned everything around. How important is it that you hear from God? That was critical for me. It was life and death. So what were those 11 words? Anybody want to know? He spoke those 11 words, and I immediately got three things out of the words he said. This is the words he says, and then the things that are sort of the sentences underneath that you know he means. What he said was, great battles come from great victories. No, I'm sorry. Great victories come from great battles, but so do great defeats. Great victories come from great battles, but so do great defeats. And I knew three things immediately when he said that. Number one, it wasn't over. Because on the outside, it looked like it was over. There was nothing left. There was no place to go. There was no talking her out of it. The kids couldn't talk her out of it. Nobody could talk her out of it. She was set. She'd planned her life. On the outside, it was over. But God was saying, it's not over. He was saying that to me again. It's not too late. Second thing he was telling me is, great victory or great defeat, choice is yours. It very much reminds me of what God told the Israelites in Deuteronomy. After he gave them the law, God spoke this really pointed word to the Israelites. God said, I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life so that you and your children and your descendants will live. The choice has been set before us, but it's up to us to make that choice. And that's what he was telling me. I can have a great victory or I can have a great defeat. That was the second thing. And the third thing was that there was a great battle. It wasn't over. It hadn't even started yet. There was a battle, a great battle ahead. Either way, you can have a great battle and lose, but you can have a great battle and win. That's those three things. It's not over. The choice is yours, and there's a battle ahead of you either way. And that opened the door to hearing from him. I spent the rest of the night talking and hearing his voice. And that went on for weeks. Every night I could hear. I'd go up there not to cry. I'd go up there to pray, to hear his voice, to be in his presence, because he had things to say. And when he was speaking to me, the pain was gone. The rest of the day, I carried this immense pain around on the inside of me. It was just overwhelming. But when I heard his voice, when he was speaking to me, the pain wasn't there. That amazed me. I never heard that. But his voice not only brought life, it took away the pain. So over the next couple of weeks, I heard him speak to me more in 2 weeks than I had the previous 25 years. I was just blown away. But one of the things he said to me right after this, he said, if you want the great victory, you need to do exactly what I tell you. Exactly. It was a very pointed thing. You need to do exactly what I tell you, and you'll get the victory. If you do not do what I tell you, you will have what you have right now, the rest of your life, defeat. And he had to remind me of that it was years of restoring our marriage, especially in that first 6 months. He had to remind me, I told you, do what I tell you. Don't do what you want to do. Do what I tell you. Don't do what you think you have a right to do, because you do have a right to do certain things, but if you do that, you will not get her back. And I decided immediately I would do what he told me to do. And it wasn't easy, because the worst was still yet to come. But God began to change things, began to change me. He opened my eyes to all the things. How much of it was mostly my fault. He showed me. In showing me what I needed to see, it was also showing me all the things I'd done wrong. And so it was a process. And one of the things he told me to do is I need to get people to fight this battle with me. He told me, go find your mighty men. And he led me to, I didn't realize this. There was a bunch of people that helped me that I went for. I talked, they counseled me, they prayed with me, they fought with me, they battled with me. A lot of believers don't know anything about spiritual warfare. So it was like when Jesus went to raise that little girl, he had to kick most of those people out of the room. They may have loved that girl who died. They may have been family, but he had to remove them from the room and only bring in people who would believe that he could do what he did. So these 6 people, actually there were 7 people. I didn't realize there were 7 until I was starting to do this, and I started writing down names, and there's 7 of them. Imagine that. All people that I respected. They were prayer warriors. They were intercessors. And they were pastors. And they helped me through the process. It took 4 years. Interesting thing, and thinking about this. This was in March, 3rd week in March. I remembered after the fact that I think it was early January, I'd gone to church, and the pastor had got up. And this is a guy I knew very well, been in that church for 20 years. We helped them start the church. He got up and said, I really feel like I'm starting a new series of messages. I really feel like God wants me to teach on spiritual warfare. So 2 months before this all happened, I remember thinking, wow, spiritual warfare. He hasn't taught on that in years. So we had 6 messages on spiritual warfare before this all happened. Right, it ended right when this happened. Interesting coincidence. God is good. So we ended up rebuilding things. It was difficult. It was hard. I was talking to the pastor, and he was helping me a lot. And I remember saying, I don't know if this is going to work. She won't go to church with me. She wants to go someplace else. She was starting to go to church other places. And this pastor, my pastor, a man I'd known for a long time, and he said, you need to go with her wherever she wants to go. He was telling me to leave the church I'd been in for 20-some years and go someplace else just to restore our marriage. And that really affected me. So she found a church she wanted to go to. I went with her. It was an amazing little family of people. They became family to us. They took us in. They loved us. They didn't know anything about us. We didn't have any responsibilities for the first time in I don't know how long. We just go there and just receive. And the pastors there, they did more to help us than they can ever know. And we will forever be grateful to John and Jen Chapel for what they did for us. Jesus said in Matthew 11:12, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, but the violent take it by force. We are going to be targets of the world, of the enemy, and the only way we're going to come on top is we have to violently take the kingdom. We have to stand. We have to know how to do spiritual warfare. We cannot just let devil steamroll over us. But it's going to take a battle. As I was preparing this, I was thinking of a verse. It just came to mind. Thanks be to God who always leads us in triumphal procession in Christ. He always leads us into victory. We're going to follow him. It'll be victory. He doesn't promise an easy life. He promises us victory. But we've got to do exactly what he tells us to do. How important is it to hear from God? It was critical. It is critical. If you've got a marriage, it's critical. If you've got children, it's critical. If you have a job or business, if you deal with human beings in any way, hearing from God is critical. I'm telling you. There's no getting around it. Isaiah 61. It says, those who grieve in Zion, to them I will bestow a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of the spirit of despair. And that's what he did for us. And we have our struggles. Just preparing this message, we had to deal with some things. But she is my best friend. And I'm glad to be with her. I'm glad to serve with her. She is an amazing woman. She has a heart for the things of God. She loves telling people about Jesus. She loves telling my grandchildren about Jesus. She loves... We are in a marriage covenant. The word says that's till death. At some point, that ends when one of us dies. But she is my sister forever. And my friend forever. And I am so thankful what God has done for us. How important is it for you to hear from God, that voice, to learn to hear what God says, because he prepares victory. It says, for the upright, for those who walk in righteousness, those who have been given the righteousness, which is what we've been given, so we can stand in the presence of God. He has prepared victory for us. There's nothing that happens that he doesn't see ahead of time. And when he prepares our destiny, he's already factored in our stupidity. I am so thankful for that. So, in closing, you need to think about how much do you need to hear from God. And I thought about this message. We could go through all the ways God speaks, but giving you the hows isn't going to work unless you have the whys. You need to know he has good things for you. I know the plans I have for you, but you're not going to walk in your destiny if you can't hear his voice. That's something he said to me, I think it was about a year ago, about the time of the election. I heard clearly, my people more than ever need to hear my voice. They will not go through this life. What's happening now, they will not survive. They will not know what's happening if they do not know how to hear my voice. It is critical. So, last thing I'm going to do. Actually, I'd like to, can you find Ephesians chapter 4 for me? Paul's praying for the church. How do you pray for believers? How do you pray for unbelievers? Ephesians chapter 4. He talks about that the eyes of your understanding will be enlightened, that you would see what God has for you. Thank you, my dear. I keep asking that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation so that you may know him better. I pray also that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, that in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you. Hope is future. The riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints and the incomparably great power for us who believe. This is how you pray for believers, that they would see what God has, that they would have a hunger for what God has for them. Because it all comes from pursuing him. So I'm going to pray for you, and after that we're going to have a time of ministry. There'll be people, if you got any needs, there'll be people here to pray. Father, I thank you for what you have shown me, that you speak to me. As a father has compassion on his children, the Lord has compassion on those who fear him, for he remembers it, how we are formed. Father, we thank you that you remember who we are and what we are, and that you love us. And because you have compassion on us, you speak to us. We thank you for your spirit of wisdom and revelation, that you would give us a hunger and a knowledge of you as we pursue you. And Father, we thank you that you love the people here, your children, and the people and those who are watching online, and anybody watching this video in the future. That you love them, you know what's ahead of them, you know what they've gone through. We thank you for your love, your mercy. We thank you that no matter what the enemy throws at us, you've already made a path to victory. And Father, I ask that you would give your people your spirit of wisdom and revelation so that they would know how high and how wide, how deep and how long, how sweet and how strong is your love for them. They'd have a revelation. Your word says that your divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of you. The more we know you, The more we seek you, the more we find you. The more we know you, the more we love you. Father, we thank you for your goodness and grace. I thank you for what you've done in my life and in our marriage. We thank you for the resurrection that you have brought into our lives. We thank you for what you are doing. We thank you that you are not done with us. You have great things. We thank you for the honor and privilege of serving you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.